I want to start with a brief philosophical introduction. I guess it's hard for me to shed my instincts. You hear a lot about relativism. You hear people say everything's relative. Well, that can't be right. It can't be right that everything's relative. Let's see. Which is the correct side of the road on which to drive your car? Well, that's relative. In England, it's the left side, and in America, it's the right side. Okay. But which is the correct side in England? Is that relative? No, that's the left side. That's the correct side, period. To say a fact is relative is to say that it's relative to something. When you fill in something it's relative to, then you get something that's absolute. That's what relative means. John is taller. Is he? Could he be taller? You want to know taller than whom? Right. Taller is a relative term. If I don't tell you than whom, I haven't said anything. But if I say John is taller than Peter, it's all over. Either he is or he isn't. It's not that John is taller than Peter is relative. It's taller is relative. Once you fill in what it's relative to, you get something absolute. Is this table in motion? It's relative. It's not in motion relative to the earth, but it is in motion relative to the sun. It depends upon what your frame of reference is, as they say in physics. But once you fix the frame, then the fact isn't relative anymore. You filled in what the original fact is relative to, you get an absolute fact. The table is moving with respect to the sun, and it isn't moving with respect to the earth, period. Because you filled in what it's relative to. In the early days of Einstein's theory of relativity, people said, Einstein has proved that everything is relative. Not only was that nonsense outside of physics, but even in physics, Einstein's whole goal was to find things that aren't relative. Indeed, Einstein's own name for his theory was invariant theory. Things that don't vary. It's just that that's not an elegant name. It didn't catch the popular interest. So people call it a relativity theory. Einstein's goal was to invent something that didn't depend upon the observer. Time depends upon the observer. Space depends upon the observer. But space-time does not. Space-time is the same for all observers. So space-time is absolute. And that's why he said that the reality of relations between objects is the space-time reality. So the idea that everything is relative and therefore nothing is absolute and there are no standards and you can do whatever you like is just a muddle. Why do I say this? Because when you come to texts, the status of the text is relative. It's relative to the use that a culture puts the text to. Only if you know the use of the text in the culture can you know how the text was intended to be understood and how the text can be judged and evaluated. Someone who will read Shakespeare's play, Julius Caesar, and complain that there is no record that Julius Caesar ever did those things or said those words, so it's just lies. Shakespeare's writing lies. He's just not telling the truth about Roman history. Such a person has missed the point. Shakespeare's not writing history. He's writing plays, literature. Shakespeare's goal was to reveal elements of human character. Whether they spoke the words or didn't speak the words, it's not relevant. Poetry often deals in metaphors which, if you take them literally, are ridiculous. If you know it's poetry, you know not to take them literally. If it isn't poetry, if it's an entry in an encyclopedia, then it better be literally true, or it's wrong. Encyclopedias aren't supposed to be written in poetry. They're supposed to be written in prose. To know what to do with the text, you have to know what the culture that produced the text used it for. Or, to be a little more general, the culture that houses the text. Maybe the culture didn't produce the text. In our case, many of our texts were produced by God. But He produced them for us. We didn't steal into God's library and relieve him of some of his private musings, private diaries. He dictated texts to us. Well, the question will be, what use did he want us to put those texts to? That will determine for us what their meaning is, how they're supposed to be judged and evaluated, if we're supposed to do that at all. Without that background, we don't know what to do with them. So we're talking about textual interpretation. Textual interpretation automatically is a matter of the social place of the text. What place does it play in the society? Another way this thought can be brought out is by a famous incident in Hillel's life, which is recorded in the Gemara. Seeing that I'm a philosopher, I take it in a philosophical way, which others might take it in a different way. A potential convert came to Hillel and said, I want to convert on the condition that you teach me only the written Torah. I don't want to learn the oral tradition, just the written. So Hillel said, fine, let's start with the letters of the Aleph Beis. The first day he taught him the first 4 letters, Aleph Beis Gimel Daled. So they go home, memorize those. Came back the next day and Hillel said, let's start by reviewing yesterday's lesson. And Hillel pointed to an Aleph and said, what's that? And the Naju said, Aleph. And Hillel said, no, that's a Dalet. He pointed to the Beis, he said to the Naju, what's that? The Naju said, Beis. Hillel said, no, that's a Gimel. And Hillel reversed the names of the letters. And the Naju said, but I'm sure you told me yesterday the opposite. Hillel said, oh, so to know the names of the letters, you have to learn it from me. Then how can you desire to learn the written without the oral? I think that Hillel was making a very profound remark. There is no text with a meaning without an oral tradition that explains what it means. And a written text has no meaning. It's just marks on paper. What gives them meaning is the fact that there's a community of people who use the language in the text. Why is that squiggle an Aleph? Because there's a living community of people who say that it's an Aleph. That's what makes it an Aleph. If they said it was a Beis, it would be a Beis. Its identity as a letter is carried by the people who speak the language. Why is Shin Lamed Ches Nun a word for this? For a table, shulchan. Why isn't it a word for a cat? Or the sun? Or cheesecake? Because the people who speak the language know that shulchan applies to things like this. It doesn't apply to cats or cheesecake or the sun. The very idea of a written text without an oral accompaniment is an incoherent idea. Philosophically, it's nonsense. Okay, I know there's the Rosetta Stone and the hieroglyphics but you do that by projecting back the life of the community, which you know from archaeology, and you do it by associating these hieroglyphics with related languages, which are spoken, have been spoken, we know how they were spoken. You use the same key. Without a living and a community that uses the language, it isn't a language, it's just marks. So the idea that you can take this text and extract it from its oral setting and understand it alone is simply to violate the place of this text in this culture. In this culture, it is part of a larger body of information, all of which is supposed to be coordinated together. It's not supposed to be understood alone. Indeed, as I heard from Rabbi Shmuel Lin, and I was told that he got it from Rosh Hashanah Hirsch, if you reflect on the history of it, it's quite the opposite of what we normally think. The Jews in the wilderness, receiving the Torah from God, what did they get first, the written or the oral? The written. They got the oral first. As a matter of fact, they got the oral first. The written text was completed only in Moses' death. Some say he wrote it all in the last few days of his life. Some say that he wrote it in pieces and finished it only at his death. The oral Moses brought down with him from Sinai and taught to the people for the entire 40 years. They got the oral first. The written only came at the end. The idea that you have a written text and then you strive to understand it, write commentaries on it, and analyze it, and apply it, is backwards. The written is, in terms of information, perhaps a précis, a summary, an index of the information that's carried in the oral, not the other way around. So that'll be the first thing, that if you're going to interpret the text and you're going to do it, given its place in this culture, that one has to see it in the environment of a much larger oral body of information, and what's supposed to be coherent is the oral body of information with the text together. Now, having said that, let's come to the understanding of the text in and of itself. Moshe Chaim, in his essay on fundamentals, which is printed at the back of some editions of the Way of God, the last 5 pages talks about the oral tradition. And he makes, what can I say? I can't judge or evaluate anything Ramchal said. He was a revolving genius. But in this passage, he says some things which are extremely important and fundamental for my concerns, my interests. I will try to explain at least one of them to you. And here I must tell you that Rabbi Kaplan made an error in his translation. The word that the Ramchal uses in that context is kavanah. Kavanah in Hebrew means intention. And Rabbi Kaplan translates it as meaning. Meaning and intention are 2 different concepts entirely. In particular, a text can have a meaning. It cannot have an intention. A dead thing cannot have an intention. Only an agent can have an intention. When Ramchal talks about intention, he's talking about God's intentions. He's not talking about the meaning of the words on the page. And here's the picture. I'm dressing this up in my own clothes, and I'm putting in my own vocabulary, but the idea is there in the Ramchal. God gave us a text. What is the text for? The text is to communicate to us information that God wants us to have. It's an instrument of communication from God to us. I'm going to put this brutally, just so the point will be clear. I'm not interested in the text as in and of itself at all. I don't care about the text at all. I care about what God wants to communicate to me through this text. I'm interested in the message, not the medium. What does God want to communicate to me through this text? How would I know? How would I know what to do with it? 300,000 plus letters. Okay, so I wrote them down, spaced the letters, made spaces for paragraphs. Now what? I haven't a clue until he tells me. He's the author. He's giving it to me. He has to tell me what to do with it. Now, as a matter of fact, God tells me to do a number of different things with it. There are a number of different ways that he's using the text to communicate to us. Teach me! 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Each one has its own methodology to extract. Imagine God says, take the first word of every, first letter of every word, string them together. That's something I want you to get. Good. Then I will ignore the rest of the letters. What are the rest of the letters there for? I don't know. To pay the scribe. Who knows? It's not my business. He's telling me he's communicating by the first letter of every word. That's what I get from it. Read every word backwards. Take the numerical values of the words. Bakasha, whatever you say. The curly cues. Good curly cues. Whatever he tells me. Now, as a matter of fact, one of the things that he tells me is he's communicating to me also through the literal meaning of the text. Okay? Oh, good. That's number 11. I'll put it down. I have 10 of them. Number 11 is the literal meaning of the text. And 12 is, 13 is, 14 is, the whole bunch of them. The literal meaning of the text isn't special. It isn't primary. It isn't more valid than anything else. I stress this because in many people's minds, even people who were raised in religious homes and have religious educational training, for many people, the pshat, literal meaning, is what it really says, and the rest is fluff. The rest is made up, the rest is entertainment, the rest is moral instruction, but it really has nothing to do with what the text says. That's got it completely upside down. I don't care what the text says. I care what God wants to communicate to me through the text. The only reason to care about what the text says, what the text means by itself, is if God tells me to care about it. Okay, as a matter of fact, He does tell me to care about it. So, I do take that into account. But it's only because it's one of the ways in which God's intentions, kavanah, His intentions of communication can be realized by understanding. So, if it's drush, if it's remez, if it's sod, if it's comparing words, like Rabbi Shmuel's 13 rules. Rabbi Shmuel's 13 rules are not rules of hermeneutics, which is supposed to reveal the meaning of the text. That's not what's going on. They are ways that God told us to decode the communication He wants to send to us through the text. It's not determining the meaning of the text. Zera Shava doesn't tell you what the text means. Binyanav and all the rest. They're rules where God said, and they're dictated at Sinai. If you want to know my communication to you, these are the rules that you need to use in order to discern the communication I'm giving you. That's why they aren't particularly logical. They don't have to be logical. They're not designed to be logical. It's a code. And God communicated to us through this text by using a code. He gave us the key to the code.
Codes don't have to be logical?
You only have to be logical in applying the rules of the code. I mean, are the rules of chess logical? Not particularly. Suppose you had 3 knights instead of 2. Suppose you had 2 queens. Well, it would be a game. It would be a game with different rules. When you apply the rules, you've got to apply them logically, otherwise you're going to lose straight out. Any intelligent person will defeat you straight out. Right? Fool's mate, and you're done in 3 moves. But the rules themselves are arbitrary. They're just created to play the game. God created the rules to give us a communication, and the rules have nothing to do, no Roman analyzing Roman texts would use these rules to figure out what Pliny the Elder meant. It had nothing to do with normal human communication. This is the way God chose to communicate to us through the text that He wrote. Okay? As I say it's because people treat pshat as if it were preeminent. Now, some people cite the famous Talmudic dictum, a verse does not exit its, what we could call a literal meaning. What the pshat is a big, long story, but let's say the literal meaning. Now here you have to understand how to read a statement of Chazal. Don't read it with a dictionary and your logical training for the New York Times. It won't help. It'll definitely hurt. What Chazal mean is this. Every verse has a pshat. Of course it has many other levels of meaning in addition, but don't abandon the pshat in a verse. So it doesn't mean everything is pshat. It just means that in addition to everything else, there's always a pshat. That's what the Chazal statement means. But as a matter of fact, it has exceptions in the Chazal themselves. There's several verses where Chazal say, this one doesn't have any pshat. So number one, it doesn't cancel out other meanings, other communications. And number two, it isn't always true either. And Chazal write that way. When they write an absolute statement, they don't mean it as absolute, that's it has exceptions. Okay, that's not our subject tonight. So when I look at the text and I want to know what is God communicating to me through this text, I have to know that there are a dozen or more methodologies. Each one reveals some level of meaning, and they're all genuine, valid, correct, right, true, real, and one of them is pshat. Now, pshat has assumed a great deal of centrality since Rashi, who wrote the first commentary that concentrated on pshat. Since him, there have been hundreds who followed his lead, some very preeminent and others not so. There are many who wrote commentaries on Rashi's commentary. Over 100 super commentaries on Rashi's commentary exist. There's one text of Mikros Villas with Rashi's commentary, and the 11 main super commentaries, all printed on Chumash. It's just the 11 main ones. Rashi's goal was to explain the Torah according to Pshat. Now, like any good author, Rashi announces his methodology. He announces his methodology in his second comment on the Torah, on the first 2 words of the Torah. It's a masterpiece, if you were more fluent in Hebrew and more fluent in patterns of Jewish thinking, I would take you through it inside of Rashi. But because for a non-trained reader, it's a little confusing, I'm going to explain it to you in a fashion that's designed to be clear. But I'm just telling you what Rashi says in his second comment on the Torah. The first two words of the Torah present an open, obvious problem. Bereshis, bara. Reshis. What does Reshis mean? Anybody here know any Hebrew?
Reshis.
Reshis. Leave off the base. Just Reshis.
Permission?
No, that's Reshus.
It's first.
Not quite. Not first.
Before.
Well, usually Rosh means head or beginning. But Reshis is different from Rosh. Reshis means beginning of. Reshis is what's called in the Hebrew smichus, a construct form, where you join one noun to another noun with of in English. Like Reshis HaMischak, the beginning of the game. Reshis HaSefer, the beginning of the book. Reshis HaMeah, the beginning of the century. Reshis is beginning of. Beginning of. After the words beginning of, what sort of word or phrase ought to come?
The world?
A noun or a verb?
No.
A noun. Beginning of the book. Beginning of the century. Beginning of the game. Right? Okay. Now what do we have in the first two words of the Torah? Bereshis bara. He created. You have a verb. So literally speaking, if I read it, if I translate it literally without any analysis, naively, it comes out, in the beginning of God created. That doesn't read. That does not compute. You can't talk that way. Not in English nor in Hebrew. In the beginning of God created. After of you need a noun, not a verb. So the first two words in the Torah are grammatically inconsistent. How's that for a beginning, huh? What to do? Rashi says, I'll tell you what I suggest. I suggest that you read the bara, he created, as if it were written baro. Same letters, just read differently. Baro in Hebrew would mean beginning. Beginning. It's called a gerund in English. Let's think. Is beginning a noun or a verb? It's a noun. Beginnings are always difficult. Beginning, the beginning is the hardest part. Beginnings can be the beginning. It can be the subject of a sentence. Swimming. Swimming is hard. Swimming is dangerous. When you put an ing on a verb, what you get is a noun. A gerund is a verbal noun. So a noun is built out of a verb. So, Rashi says, I suggest you read it like this. In the beginning of God's creating. That's fine grammatically. God's creating is a noun, and it can have a beginning. Rashi says, but of course it isn't written below. You can't play games like that. Leave that for slipshod, politically motivated anti-scholars. You can't reread it, rewrite it, pretend. Rashi says, I'll tell you what I mean. What I mean is that this is a biblical idiom. When you have a construct form followed by a verb, the Tanakh intends you to understand it as if it were a gerund with an ing at the end. And I'll prove it to you, says Rashi. If you look at the second verse in the book of Hosea, you have an exactly parallel form. Tchilas, diber, Hashem b'Hosea. Tchilas is beginning of. Tchilah is beginning. Tchilas is beginning of. Diber means he spoke. Literally, it would be the beginning of God spoke. But since it's the second verse in the book, and it's introducing God speaking to Hosea, says Rashi, clearly over there what it means is the beginning of God speaking. it means you to take it as a noun, as a verb, as a gerund, as a verbal noun. So just like over there it means speaking, I say, says Rashi, over here it means creating. That's the pshat that Rashi suggests. Now Rashi invents a critic. A critic, I left something out, we'll come back to it. He invents a critic to attack himself. He says, the critic will tell you that there are many sentences in the Tanakh which leave out words, what we call elliptical. They leave out words, and they expect the reader to fill in the missing words. And he gives 4 examples. And one of them is directly parallel to the first verse in Genesis. Indeed, he uses the same word. The verse is a verse from Isaiah which says, Magid Mereshis Acharis, which translated literally means, he declares from the beginning of, the end of. Of course, the reader says, beginning of what? End of what? It's just blank. It says, he declares from the beginning of, the end of. Rashi's imagined critic says, obviously the reader is meant to fill in. He declares from the beginning of everything, the end of everything. And since Isaiah left it out, it must be acceptable in the usage of the Tanakh to write Reshis and leave out the noun that comes afterwards. Why can't I, says the critic, say the same thing about the first verse in the Torah? Bereshis bara, in the beginning of blank, God created. There's a blank there. And it's expected that the reader will fill in the obvious missing piece, which is Hakol, and read, in the beginning of everything, God created the heavens and the earth. So Rashi says, the critic will tell you, I have a different solution to the problem. The problem is a genuine problem. You have beginning of and no noun. I, said Rashi, suggest you transform the verb into a noun. The critic says, don't transform. Just fill in the missing noun, as it is in many places in the Tanakh, and even one place with the very same word, Reshis. Furthermore, Rashi points out that the critic has an advantage on his side. Because if you read the verses the way the critic suggests, here's how it comes out. In the beginning of everything, God created the heavens and the earth. Period. That's verse 1. And the earth was formless and void, and the darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. Light now comes second or third. In the beginning, God created heavens and the earth. In verse 3, He created light. That means, according to the critic, the first verses in the Torah start at time 0. They are describing creation ex nihilo, creation out of nothing, which is a cardinal Jewish belief, and which went against the beliefs of other religions in the ancient world. Isn't it nice that you can understand in a natural way the verses to express this cardinal Jewish belief that God created everything out of nothing? But according to Rashi, you don't get that. The verses don't read like that at all. Let's try to read through it the way Rashi does it. And by the way, in the stone chumash, they do it the way according to Rashi. In the beginning of God's creating the heavens and the earth, what is the punctuation mark at this point? That's the end of verse 1. Comma, not period. It's a dependent clause. In the beginning of God's creating heaven and the earth, what has happened so far? Nothing. We're just getting backdrop. We're setting the stage. And the earth was formless and void, and the darkness on the face of the deep. God's Spirit was hovering over the waters. It's all backdrop. God said, let there be light. And there was light. The first thing that's described as being created, the first divine action is creating light. Says Rashi, that means according to my translation, Rashi says, you're not starting at time 0. You're starting somewhere in the middle of the creative process. You don't get the initial state. Which means you lose a description of creation ex nihilo. So isn't the critic better off? He's got just as much justification for his position. He's done it by comparing it with other places in the Tanakh. He's solving the grammatical problem, and he preserves the classical Jewish belief. Says Rashi, if that's the critic's attack, he should be astonished at himself, because he's missed something crucial. What he's missed is the fact that in verse 2 talks about the water. There's something else he missed, but let's just take that fact. He missed the water. The Spirit of God is hovering above the waters. What waters? Which waters? Where waters? Where do the waters come from? All you have, even according to the critic's translation, all you have in verse 1 is heavens and earth. And now I tell you, lest you say, oh, by earth we mean the globe and all that is therein, including all the water. Well, on the next page it says that God called Eretz, Yabashah, Eretz. He called dry land Eretz. Eretz is the word for earth, and that's the name for the dry land. So Eretz doesn't mean the globe. Eretz means the dry land. Says Rashi, you are forced to acknowledge a prior stage in which various things were done that are not being described here in the text. So the text starts in the middle. And therefore Rashi says my pshat is right, and the critic's pshat is wrong. Let's see what Rashi has told us here. Number one, you want to explain the verse according to pshat. Grammar is relevant. Comparative text is relevant throughout the rest of the Tanakh. Rashi brings from all over. And so does the critic. Context is relevant. It's got to fit into the context in which this particular passage fits. Those are the relevant considerations, and others similar to them, which can be used to determine what the pshat is. That's number one. Number two is something about which you can fight. Rashi invents a critic and answers him, which means this is something for which critics can be active. Something that's based on applying objective rules, not a matter of authority. Indeed, Rashi's pshat, as far as I know, doesn't exist before him. He certainly didn't take it from Chazal. It's not written anywhere before him. It's his own analysis. So he's telling you pshat is something which any person can think up. It has to be defended on textual grounds. And if somebody thinks he's got a better pshat, he has a right to object and reject your pshat. That's how his analysis works. Now, let me come to the part that I left out. When Rashi introduces the problem, he says, by implication, Bereshis needs a noun. Bara is a verb. Doesn't fit together grammatically. Our rabbis interpret it as follows. These are the rabbis of the Talmud, the Midrash. Beis of Bereshis means for the sake of. Reshis is a code word. Reshis either refers to the Jewish people or to the Torah. And they understood the verse as saying, for the sake of the Jewish people or the Torah, God created the heavens and the earth. He quotes this rabbinic comment, and then he says, if you want to explain it according to the pshat, you should do it my way. What is Rashi doing? He's introducing his commentary. He's introducing the method of his commentary. First he cites two statements from Chazal, and then he says, but I'm not doing that. If you want to do it according to pshat, you have to do it differently. Don't do it the way Chazal did it. So why are you citing it? And why do you cite it first? By implication, Rashi is making precise to the point that I told you from Moshe Chaim Lutzato. He's saying the rabbis faced this grammatical problem and they solved it according to one of the accepted methods of communication. What the rabbis say about this verse is true, real, valid, appropriate, divine. The verse really communicates the purpose for which God created the world. That's one of its jobs in communication. But that's on a different level. It's not on the level of Pshat. I have chosen to write my commentary on the level of Pshat. I'm dedicating my commentary to Pshat. So he cites the rabbinic comment to, number one, give them priority of place, to acknowledge that there are other methods in which the text genuinely communicates, and then simply to differentiate himself and say, that's all valid, it's all correct, it's all true, but it's not what I'm doing in my commentary. Let's understand, why isn't the rabbinic comment pshat? Where does it fail to be pshat? What about taking the bays, the single letter bays, and reading as for the sake of? That's not the problem. Because as a matter of fact, in the book of Genesis itself, in the literal pshat, the letter bays does mean for the sake of. When Jacob takes up residence with his uncle, Lavan, and his uncle says, you're working for me for nothing, name your wages. Jacob says, I will serve you 7 years for the sake of Rachel, your younger daughter, and the for sake of there is bays. So taking the bays as for the sake of is a literal usage. That in and of itself could be pshat. But to take reshis as a code word for the Jewish people, for the Torah, that's not pshat. It's not based on the literal meaning of the word at all. It's based on an association with verses much later in the Tanakh, where the Jewish people is called reshis, and the Torah is called reshis. That's only an association. That's not pshat. Good. It's a different level. Call it drush. It's true. The verse communicates from God the purpose of creation. Just not through pshat. Through pshat, it's talking about something else. It's communicating it in a different way. So Rashi is explicitly acknowledging that pshat is just one of the ways in which the Torah communicates. Now, that means that Rashi's usage of earlier sources is going to be selective and motivated by his own standards. Many times when he asks a question about a verse, there are comments on the verse in the Midrash or in the Talmud, and Rashi does not use them. Why? Because the rabbis in the Talmud and the Midrash, in those places, are not addressing pshat. They're using one of the other methods of communication to extract something that God wants to communicate to us through the verse, and not doing it on the level of pshat. Sometimes Rashi does use it. Sometimes the rabbis will make a string of comments, and he will select out and use some of them and not others in the same passage. Why? Because some of the comments really are used for the sake of pshat, and some are not. In some cases, the rabbis will make a comment on one verse, and Rashi will move the comment to a different verse. Why? Because the verse on which the rabbis expressed the comment was not on the level of pshat. And Rashi needed the comment on a different verse in order to explain pshat. Often enough, later scholars disagree with Rashi. The Ramban and other later scholars quote Rashi's comments and disagree. And they analyze differently. Because it's a free-for-all. It's not based on the fact that you have a bigger authority or you can quote an earlier source. It's a question of your own analysis. And pshat works independently like that till the present day. Indeed, there's an enigmatic Rashbam. Rashbam was one of Rashi's grandchildren. And Rashbam writes, in the beginning of his commentaries of Vayeshev, that he argued with Rashi about his method, and Rashi admitted to him that his methods could have been done a different way, and that Rashi said to the Rashbam, if he had had time, he would have written another commentary. Now, we don't get any more than that. Nothing more said than the Rashbam what exactly was the point of the debate, and what Rashi would have done, but it shows the sense of which it's open to discussion. And that means that one can try to understand and now usually Rashi's commentary and the commentaries of those who follow him start like this. They look at a verse and they look for problems. I hope this isn't really necessary, but I'll just mention it for the sake of completeness. Looking for problems in a verse, thinking of objections to the verse, is not a failure of piety. The way you understand what something means is to challenge it. You're not suggesting that God made a mistake. What you're suggesting is, if I can think of a challenge, then I don't understand it. That's a way to test my understanding. Indeed, the strongest way to motivate a challenge is to try to rewrite the text. If you think there's something difficult about the text, rewrite it. Rewrite it in such a way that it'll make the point that you want it to make and won't damage other things that it has to, other information it has to convey. If you could do that, if you think you could do that, then you have a good challenge. Your question will be, why didn't it write it this way? Since it could have written the same thing, clearer, more direct, why didn't it write it this way? Very often, Rashi comments without telling you what the problems are. In this second comment in the Torah, because he's laying out his methodology, he tells you what all the problems are, and he gives you all the solutions, and he goes through the argumentation back and forth. Most of the time, Rashi just says, this is what it means. And he expects that you, being an educated, alert, and critical reader, you figure it out for yourself what the problems are. Rashi comes along, riding in on the white horse, says, here are your solutions. But if you don't know what the problems are, you don't know what Rashi's doing. People read Rashi in between the Aliyahs and Shabbos as if it was entertainment. Rashi is a gigantic logical study. You have to figure out what bothered Rashi, and then you have to try to figure out why he used his comment to answer it, and why he didn't use a different comment to answer it. If you do that, the study of Chumash with Rashi is endless. It repays endless effort, endless investment. Every year when I go through, I find new understanding, new insights, and I'll share a couple of ideas with you as to how this works. When Jacob leaves home on his way to get married, it says he left Beersheba on his way to Haran, Vayifga b'makom. Rashi offers two translations. Makom means place. One is he arrived at the place, and the other is that he prayed to God. Because paga, pei, gimel, ayin, in Hebrew, can mean to entreat, and it can mean to arrive at. Now, when I first read that, I thought to myself, Jacob's on a trip. And this is where he's going to lie down, go to sleep, and spend the night. Of course, it means he arrived at the place. Maybe the verb is ambiguous. Okay, the verb is ambiguous. But clearly in the context, you know which of the meanings it's intended to carry. Why would Rashi cite both meanings? What's the purpose of that? Then I thought about it a little more. I realized that I was missing something very important. The Torah used an ambiguous verb, paga, which has two meanings. Didn't have to do that. There's a verb in biblical Hebrew that isn't ambiguous. Lahagia. Lahagia means to arrive at. So why did the Torah choose an ambiguous verb when it had available a verb with a single meaning? Isn't that an indication that the Torah wanted you to think of both meanings? I think it is. But even more than that, after I overcame my natural laziness, I took out a concordance. You know what a concordance is? A concordance is a book with all the words in the Tanakh, for each word, every place it appears in the Tanakh. It's a gigantic accomplishment. The guy who did it in the 1890s named Mandelkorn, the rumor is that he went crazy. Every L, Aleph Lamed. There are maybe thousands of them. And he wrote down every one with every verse in the context, the few words before and after, the context of every L, every who, every he. It's an enormous, unbelievable thing. Now they did it with a computer. But it makes all sorts of mistakes when you do it with a computer. Because it compiles spellings. It doesn't realize that the spellings don't always have the same meaning. I looked up once Baal, Beis Ayin Lamed, and one of the verses that it brought is a verse where it's Baal with a yoke. And I wanted Baal, meaning master, but it's Beis Ayin Lamed, so I just wrote Beis Ayin Lamed. Didn't know that Baal isn't Baal. That's ridiculous. This Mandelkorn went through using the understanding of the words, grouped them together according to grammar, every word in the Tanakh. So you want to know what a word means, how it's used in the Tanakh, you take out the concordance, you look it up. Finally, I looked up paga. And this is what I found. When the verb paga means to arrive at a place, the subject of the verb is a boundary. It's used for drawing boundaries, boundaries of areas, boundaries of countries, boundaries of regions. It's never used for a person, a flock of sheep, a herd of goats, a flock of birds, an army, a group of ships. It's never used for motion. If you tell me, Vayivka b'makom, in Yaakov's case, means he arrived at the place, it'll be the only occurrence in the entire Tanakh where the thing doing the arriving is a movable object that was moving from place to place. So, that's an indication that saying it meant to arrive is at least unusual. Those are two good reasons for citing the other meaning of entreating as part of what's intended in this case. If you don't analyze that way, so you think, what was Rashi doing? Rashi wants to teach you some morals, some ethical idea or some spiritual idea. One should pray and so on and so on. No, Rashi's basing it on the meaning of the verses. When Cain kills Hevel, and God speaks to Cain, if you look carefully at what God says to Cain, you'll see that it is not, as a professor that I had at the university said, the Jewish God of vengeance thundering from the heavens. It's nothing of the kind. Indeed, the message that God gives to Cain there is a message of encouragement and support and hope. He says to him, why are you upset and why are you downcast? Isn't it true that if you improve, you'll be forgiven? And if you don't improve, sin is crouching at the opening. Its desire is to conquer you, its desire is to get you, and you can conquer it. So it's a message of support. But let's just take the middle part and try to analyze. If you improve, you'll be forgiven. If you don't improve, sin is crouching at the opening.
Sin is crouching at the opening?
Right. Your translation will say door, but that's wrong. Pesach doesn't mean door. Telos means door. Pesach means open. That will be important for us. Okay, now let's think. If you improve, does this sound balanced to you? If you improve, you'll be forgiven. If you don't improve, sin is crouching at the opening. What would you expect? If you improve, you'll be forgiven. If you don't improve, then you won't be forgiven. If A, then B. If not A, then not B. That's what you would expect. Here you have, if A, then B. And if not A, Q. Thanks a lot. I mean, it's just not balanced. It just doesn't connect. Secondly, opening of what? It's opening. Door, not only is door the wrong translation, but door is a very funny picture. Sin is crouching at the door. Okay, so if I'm indoors, if I'm in home, I can't do anything wrong. But the minute I walk outside, sin is waiting to get me, because you can only do crimes outside. No crimes inside. That's idiotic. What would be the picture of sin crouching at the door? Rashi says 4 words in Hebrew, and he solves both problems. He tells us what the openings are opening of, and he restores balance to the verse, and the verse then comes to teach a profound message. LePesach kivracha chata'acha shamur. At the opening of your grave, your sin is preserved. The opening of your grave, your sin is preserved. Let's think through the verses again. If you improve, you'll be forgiven. If you improve, when? By next Tuesday? By your 37th birthday? If you improve, when?
Before you die.
Before you die. You have your whole lifetime to improve. There's no limit to set to when you can improve. God says if you improve, you'll be forgiven. And if you don't improve, when? Over your whole lifetime. Then your sin won't disappear. It won't dissipate to the morning mist. It's preserved at your grave, and you'll be paid for it after death. It means you won't be forgiven. He's restored the logical balance. Again, if you improve sometime during your lifetime, you'll be forgiven. And if you don't improve sometime during your lifetime, then at the opening of your grave, your sin is preserved, which means your sin still exists. You won't be forgiven. So Rashi has restored the logical balance and explained opening of what, and it makes this being the earliest statement, one of the earliest statements in the Tanakh of responsibility for crime. Only Adam and Eve precede him. That it states a very important principle that improving can slough off the crime, and failure to improve means that death is no escape. But it's based on a logical analysis. It's not importing a theological or moral idea and pressing it on the text. On the contrary, it's a way of reading the logical implication of the text. This study is the most attractive to beginners because you don't need to learn a special methodology. All the others are based on very specialized rules and sophisticated analyses and applications. You just have to be logical. However, as you have in Rashi's first example, you have to know the Tanakh as a whole, because references and relevant passage can come from anywhere in the Tanakh, and you have to be very smart. That's why people usually trust these classical commentators. You have a continuous competition of Jewish scholarship, greatest minds, people who have spent their lives to analyze, and only the top winners got accepted throughout the generations. If Rashi says something, you pay attention. Especially when you spend many years reading Rashi, and one after another, you get insight after insight after insight. That's how Pshat is done. That's the place that the Pshat plays in our use of the text. Questions? Yeah.
So, basically, Rashi tries to rewrite it in a way that makes sense, and then tries to figure out why it doesn't make sense, or not why it doesn't make sense, but why it's written that way.
That's right.
And he uses his knowledge of the entire Tanakh to decipher why it's not written that way. So it's all based on something a different part of the Tanakh. Or?
Well, it works like this. If I say the verse is intended to express ABC, gosh, I could write ABC much easier. I could write it much more direct. Then probably I misunderstood what the text is trying to express. So I've misread the words or the construction or the context or something. I don't know what the text wants to express. So then you have to ask yourself, well, how would I figure out what the text really wants to express? Look throughout the Tanakh, look for parallel words, parallel passages, parallel ideas, and try to play one off against the other. By the way, the same rule applies to rabbinic writings. I'll just mention briefly one word. I had a discussion with a certain rabbi through emails about this. Chazal make a statement. And you think, oh, what they basically mean is this. And then you attack this. And you have all sorts of objections against this. Take a look. Let's imagine that the statement of Chazal is 20 words long. You say they basically mean this in 6 words. And your 6 words are very clear, very direct, very precise. You have to ask yourself, if that's what Chazal meant, and you said it in 6 words, why didn't they say it in 6 words? Why did they say it in 20 words? Must mean they didn't mean what you think they meant. They must have meant something else. Otherwise, they would have said it your way. So it's the same logic. Now, for example, Chazal say, anyone who says David sinned is mistaken. Anyone who says David sinned is mistaken. The naive reader says, oh, they're telling me David didn't sin. Well, what do you mean he didn't sin? Doesn't the Tanakh say he sinned clearly? And they go on and on and on with their naive ruminations. But look, their phrase is, anyone who says David sinned is mistaken. You say, in 3 words, David didn't sin. Your statement is shorter, clear, precise. You have to ask yourself, why didn't Chazal say it my way? If what they meant is what I'm saying, they should have said it my way. They weren't being paid by the word to write more words. So they didn't mean that. They didn't mean David didn't sin. What they mean is, anyone who thinks that by the basis of his analysis, he can figure out what the sin was, he will be mistaken. Because there are special conditions which render the analysis very difficult, very subtle, and only someone who is in possession of the oral tradition will know, in fact, what the sin was. They didn't say he didn't sin. And indeed, no one says that he didn't sin. It's just a naive reader who reads what Chazal say and then paraphrases it and attacks the paraphrase and doesn't stop to ask himself, if my paraphrase is so much shorter and so much clearer, why didn't Chazal put it that way? It's a sign they didn't mean what I mean. They meant something else. I have to think again what they meant. So this is the way the rule is followed. If I have a simpler paraphrase that does it cheaper and clearer, and the text doesn't say that, whether it's Chazal or whether it's the Torah, Tanakh, then I have to conclude that that's not what it really meant. Okay? Yeah.
One more question: Is it wrong to assume that the patterns that are in the Chumash and Nevi'im and Ketuvim, like, is it wrong to think that they all should follow like some sort of a different pattern?
I'll tell you, it's a big subject. Let me just give you, I think, a general picture. The Tanakh was written over 1,000 years. It would be very natural for a language to evolve in 1,000 years. It would be natural. One would expect it. But you can't live in the fairy castle of your intuitions. Open your eyes and take a look. In the Psalms, does Shulchan mean table? Like it does in the book of Exodus? Well, if it does, then that word didn't change. Does Ish mean man in both places? Then the word didn't change. So just take a look and see how much has really changed. When you see that the vast majority didn't change, then you say, it would be natural if there were changes in 1,000 years, and I will have my eyes open. If I'll find a usage that's very peculiar, that will be a place to think maybe this word did change its meaning, but only if I have positive evidence. Because I see for myself that the vast majority of words didn't change their meaning. Ezekiel is writing in the Babylonian exile. The words mean the same as they mean in the book of Genesis, in the book of Exodus. So the language of, at least the literary language, didn't change. Whether spoken languages changed, whether Aramaic was in wide usage and so on and so on, but the language of this literature didn't change much. And that's why you can bring analyses back and forth from across hundreds of years. English isn't like that. German isn't like that. The language changes much more rapidly. And in this case, it's an empirical question. Did it change or didn't it change? You see, the vast majority didn't change. Okay? All right.